That house with the quarter-moon windows is an icon of terror. For decades, one question has defined the legend of the Amityville Horror. Was it a true paranormal siege, or was it all an elaborate and lucrative hoax? By the end of this investigation, you will have the tools to dissect this famous mystery for yourself, weighing the chilling personal testimony against a shocking web of financial motives and admitted deceit. We will examine the blurry line where supernatural fear meets human deception, exploring both the eerie phenomena reported and the concrete evidence that suggests a carefully crafted story. What really happened during those 28 days inside that house, and why does this particular tale of horror cling so stubbornly to our imagination? Their story begins with a hopeful move on December 23, 1975. George and Kathy Lutz, along with Kathy's 3 children from a previous marriage, saw the large Dutch colonial house on the water as a fresh start, a dream home purchased at a significant discount given its grim history. The initial signs were subtle, easy to dismiss as the quirks of an old house. There were inexplicable cold drafts in certain rooms, even with the heat on. A sickly sweet odor like rotting flowers would appear and vanish. Most tellingly, their large dog, a German shepherd named Harry, would often whimper and plant his feet, refusing to go up the stairs or into specific rooms. These were the whispers of the house, the first hints that something was not right, but the whispers soon became shouts. Within days, the family reported waking every morning at exactly 3:15 in the morning, the same time the DeFeo murders had occurred. Green, foul-smelling slime began to ooze from the walls and keyholes. In the dead of winter, a room would suddenly fill with a swarm of large, black flies. Kathy Lutz claimed she was once physically lifted from her bed by an unseen force. The children spoke of an invisible friend named Jody, who they later described as a demonic, pig-like creature with glowing red eyes. George Lutz, a former Marine, found his personality darkening, becoming obsessed with the basement fireplace and chopping wood in the freezing cold. The psychological toll was immense, a constant state of dread and exhaustion that wore the family down day by day. Their unified testimony described a 28-day descent into a waking nightmare. They spoke of hearing marching band music when none was playing, of seeing shadowy figures in the windows, and of crucifixes being turned upside down. The final breaking point came on the night of January 14th. They claimed a powerful, malevolent force began pounding on the doors and shaking the house. In a state of sheer, unadulterated terror, the Lutzes gathered their children, left every possession behind, and fled the house for good, checking into a hotel and never returning. This was the core of the haunting, a first-hand account of a family driven from their home by phenomena they could not explain. Their story was detailed, emotional, and terrifyingly consistent. But was it the whole truth, or merely the opening act of a much more calculated performance? But to understand the haunting, we must first understand the horror that preceded it. The story of the Amityville Horror is forever anchored to a single, brutal night in November of 1974. On November 13th, 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. walked through his family's home and shot his mother, father, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters as they slept in their beds. Each victim was found face down, with no signs of struggle, suggesting they never even woke up. It was a crime of such shocking and intimate violence that it shattered the quiet community of Amityville. DeFeo was arrested the same day. His initial explanation to police was as chilling as the act itself. He claimed that upon returning home, he discovered his family murdered and ran to a nearby bar for help. That story quickly fell apart under questioning. He then offered a different, more spectral defense. He said that voices in the house, voices that had tormented him for years, had finally commanded him to kill. He spoke of hearing his family plotting against him, of a constant, paranoid fear that drove him to violence. At trial, his lawyers pursued an insanity defense based on these claims, but the jury did not accept it. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was found guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. This was the concrete, tragic reality. A real family was gone, a real murderer was behind bars, but the house itself, the physical location of this atrocity, remained. It sat empty for over a year, a local monument to unspeakable grief and violence. This is the crucial foundation. When the Lutz family moved, and 13 months later, they weren't just buying a house with a sad history. They were moving into a crime scene, a place where the air was still thick with the memory of a massacre. The DeFeo murders provided the perfect, terrifying bedrock for a supernatural legend. It transformed the house from a simple building into a character, a vessel believed to be stained by evil. The timeline was irresistible. The haunting reportedly began at 3:15 in the morning, the exact time of the murders. The phenomena the Lutzes described felt like echoes of that violent night, as if the house itself was replaying its trauma. This potent cocktail of verified crime and unverified paranormal activity is what gave the Amityville story its unique power. The real bloodshed made the subsequent ghost story feel terrifyingly possible. Into this volatile mix of crime and claimed haunting stepped two figures who would become synonymous with the paranormal themselves. Ed and Lorraine Warren were not your typical ghost hunters. He was a former police officer and self-taught demonologist, she a professed clairvoyant and medium. Together, they founded the New England Society for Psychic Research, operating from their home, which they called a supernatural museum, filled with artifacts from their cases. Their methodology was a unique fusion, a blend of traditional Catholic beliefs about demonic hierarchy and Lorraine's reported psychic impressions. They approached hauntings with a specific worldview, one that saw many supernatural disturbances not as harmless ghosts, but as active demonic infestations seeking to attach to people and places. When the Lutzes reached out in desperation, the Warrens arrived at the Amityville house. Their investigation, conducted after the family had fled, was brief but definitive in their eyes. They reported an overwhelming sense of oppressive evil within the home. Lorraine claimed to feel the presence of a violent, inhuman entity, a demonic force that had been attracted by the DeFeo murders. Ed Warren declared the house was not merely haunted, but was a portal, a gateway to a profound and ancient evil. This diagnosis was catastrophic in its implications. It meant the activity wasn't residual energy from a tragic event, but the work of a conscious, malevolent intelligence. The Warrens' involvement was a pivotal turning point. They were not just believers, they were presented as experts, a husband and wife team with a research society and decades of experience. Their endorsement transformed the Lutz family's frightening story from a private ordeal into a certified paranormal event. By framing it within the stark, dramatic language of demonology and portals, they gave the Amityville case a terrifying cosmic significance. It became the ultimate validation, a professional seal on a supernatural horror story. This case, more than any other, catapulted the Warrens into the national spotlight, solidifying their reputations and making the Amityville Horror a cornerstone of their legendary career. Yet their conclusions, while compelling, would soon face a scrutiny as intense as the phenomena they claimed to document. Yet for a story of such cosmic evil, the physical proof offered to the public was surprisingly, and often controversially, mundane. Supporters of the haunting pointed to a handful of tangible artifacts, pieces of evidence meant to move the tale beyond mere testimony. The most famous of these is likely the Ghost Boy photograph. Taken by a news photographer named Gene Campbell during a press tour of the empty house, the image appears to show a faint, translucent figure of a young boy peering from an upstairs window. It is an undeniably eerie image, one that seems to capture a spectral child watching the living from within the haunted home. However, skeptics quickly offered alternative explanations. They pointed out that the figure's blurry, indistinct shape could easily be a trick of light and reflection on the old, wavy glass of the window pane, or even a result of the photographic development process itself. Without a clear, unambiguous form, the Ghost Boy remained a compelling maybe, not a definitive yes. Then there were the sounds from the silence. Investigators, including the Warrens, claimed to have captured electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, within the house. These are sounds believed by some to be spirit voices, recorded on audio tape where no living person was speaking. The most iconic of these is a single, growled command allegedly captured during a psychic recording session. On the tape, a deep, guttural voice seems to utter the words, "Get out." It is a chilling audio clip that perfectly matches the narrative of a hostile entity demanding the family leave. But the analysis of such evidence is fraught with subjectivity. Critics argue that what sounds like "get out" could be random noise, a creak of the house settling, or even the unintentional groan of a person present, reinterpreted by a mind already primed to hear a paranormal threat. This phenomenon, known as auditory pareidolia, is where our brains impose meaningful patterns, like words, onto random sounds. The power of the "get out" recording lies not in its clarity, but in the terrifying context we place upon it. Other physical oddities were reported by the Lutzes themselves. They spoke of finding cloven hoof prints in the snow leading up to the house, prints that vanished at the wall as if something had walked right through it. They described discovering their metal silverware bent and twisted into bizarre shapes overnight. On the surface, these are disturbing details that suggest a physical, invasive presence. But when examined as potential evidence, their value diminishes. The footprints in the snow, for instance, were never photographed by the family or properly documented for investigators to examine. They remained a fleeting anecdote. The bent silverware, while strange, is something that could be accomplished with human hands and a bit of strength. Without controlled conditions or independent verification, these manifestations become personal mysteries, not public proof. They are the kinds of eerie occurrences that feel profoundly real to those who experience them, yet remain frustratingly impossible to authenticate for anyone else. This gap between personal terror and provable fact is the very canyon the Amityville story straddles, leaving us to wonder where perception ends and reality begins. But every compelling horror story needs its skeptics, and the Amityville tale soon found formidable ones. Enter Dr. Stephen Kaplan, a parapsychologist with a very different reputation from the Warrens. Kaplan ran the Parapsychology Institute of America and was known for his rigorous, evidence-based approach. He visited the house, interviewed the Lutzes extensively, and came to a starkly different conclusion. He saw not a demonic portal, but a perfect storm of psychological and financial pressures. Kaplan pointed to the family's dire financial situation. The Lutzes had purchased the expensive waterfront property with a very small down payment and were struggling under the weight of the mortgage, taxes, and upkeep. They were, by many accounts, in over their heads. Their terrifying 28-day ordeal, Kaplan suggested, provided a dramatic and face-saving reason to abandon a house they could not afford, while simultaneously opening the door to a lucrative new opportunity. That opportunity materialized with astonishing speed. Within weeks of fleeing, the Lutzes had secured a book deal with writer Jay Anson. The book, The Amityville Horror, became a runaway bestseller. Almost immediately, movie rights were sold for a substantial sum. The family's frightening personal experience was now a commercial property, and their financial fortunes had reversed overnight. Investigative journalist Rick Moran dug even deeper, uncovering timelines and contracts that painted a picture of a story crafted for maximum impact. He and other critics noted that many of the most dramatic paranormal events described in the book, like the marching band music or the green slime, were never mentioned in the Lutzes' initial statements to friends or the press. These details, they argued, seemed to appear and grow more elaborate as the book was being written, tailored to make a more terrifying narrative. This doesn't necessarily mean the Lutzes were cold-blooded liars from the start. Skeptics like Kaplan proposed a more nuanced explanation, one rooted in human psychology. Imagine moving your family into a house where a mass murder occurred just a year prior. Every creak of the floorboards, every moan of the wind in the eaves is filtered through that terrifying knowledge. This is the power of suggestion, a psychological phenomenon where expectation shapes perception. In a state of high anxiety, a house settling on its foundation can sound like footsteps. A draft under a door can feel like an icy breath. The mind, especially one primed for fear, seeks patterns and confirms its own biases. This could have escalated into a form of collective hysteria, where the shared anxiety of the family members amplified individual fears, creating a feedback loop of escalating paranormal interpretations. A child's nightmare becomes a sighting of a demonic pig. A husband's stress-induced obsession with the fireplace becomes a demonic influence. What began as normal reactions to a deeply unsettling environment could have, through a combination of suggestion, fear, and perhaps a growing awareness of the story's potential value, crystallized into the unified legend we know today. The rational counter-narrative asks us to consider a different kind of haunting, one not of ghosts, but of the human mind's incredible power to build a nightmare from suggestion, stress, and the echoes of a very real tragedy. The true turning point, the moment the private terror became public property, arrived in 1977 with the publication of a single book. Author Jay Anson, a former public relations writer and documentary filmmaker, was hired to transform the Lutz family's recorded recollections into a narrative. His method was straightforward, yet it would become the core of the controversy. Anson did not conduct independent research into the DeFeo murders. He did not interview neighbors or police. He worked almost exclusively from the taped interviews with George and Kathy Lutz, weaving their memories into a chronological, first-person account told from George's perspective. This approach gave the book, titled simply The Amityville Horror, an intimate, confessional power. Readers felt they were hearing the unfiltered truth from a man who lived it. But Anson was not a journalist, he was a storyteller. In later interviews, he openly admitted to taking creative liberties, to embellishing scenes for dramatic effect. He described his process as writing a novel based on a true story, a crucial distinction that often got lost in the marketing frenzy. His prose was vivid and sensational, deliberately crafted to scare. The demonic pig creature Jody, for instance, was described in the book with chilling specificity, its glowing red eyes piercing the darkness. This image, straight from classic horror tropes, became seared into the public consciousness, yet it was an elaboration on the children's simpler, earlier descriptions. The book transformed reported feelings of being watched into scenes of palpable, physical menace. It took the family's genuine fear and amplified it with the tools of a horror novelist, pacing the scares, building suspense, and culminating in the frenzied, final night escape. The effect was explosive. The Amityville Horror skyrocketed to the top of bestseller lists, captivating millions. It presented itself not as a speculative analysis, but as a documented true story, a nonfiction account. For the average reader, the line between what the Lutzes actually experienced and what Anson dramatized vanished completely. The book's success did more than just make money, it validated the haunting in the court of public opinion. If it was in a best-selling book sold as fact, it must be true, right? This blurring of boundaries was the book's greatest legacy. It turned a local, disputed account into a national sensation, creating a template for the modern paranormal thriller. But with every chilling chapter, it also raised an unavoidable question. Were readers trembling at the supernatural or at the masterful craft of a storyteller who knew exactly how to make them tremble? If the book made the story a sensation, the film made it a visceral, unforgettable nightmare. Released in 1979, the movie adaptation starring James Brolin and Margot Kidder did something the written word could not. It gave the haunting a face, a sound, and a terrifying rhythm. The film's genius lay in its atmosphere, from the opening aerial shots of that ominous house looming under a gray sky to the haunting, discordant score by Lalo Schifrin. Every frame was designed to unsettle. This was not a story about jump scares, but about a slow, creeping dread that seeped into the very walls of the Lutz home on screen. The audience didn't just hear about the cold spots, they saw the character's breath fog in the air. They didn't just read about George's descent, they watched James Brolin's warm demeanor curdle into a chilling, hollow-eyed obsession, his eyes growing darker as he chopped wood in a frenzy. The film took the book's embellishments and rendered them in stark, cinematic reality, making the supernatural feel immediate and physically threatening. Perhaps no moment is more iconic than the scene where the entity's command finally erupts. As the family cowers in fear, a deep, guttural roar, more animal than human, shakes the house. It doesn't just say get out, it screams it with a force that vibrates through the theater speakers. That single audio cue, lifted from the controversial EVP, became a cultural touchstone, an auditory stamp of absolute evil. By translating alleged evidence into a dramatic centerpiece, the film blurred the line between reported phenomenon and cinematic fact. Yet the movie took significant creative liberties, weaving in entirely new elements for dramatic punch. The most famous of these is the imaginary friend Jody, who in the film is depicted as a glowing, demonic pig creature that appears at windows, a visual far more specific and horrifying than the children's original descriptions. It also invented the character of Father Delaney, a priest based loosely on a real clergyman who visited the house and showed him being attacked by a swarm of flies and stricken with a sudden, violent illness. These scenes, while powerful, were fictionalized amplifications. Their impact, however, was profound. For millions of viewers who never read the book or followed the skeptical reports, this film was their primary, and often only, source for the Amityville story. It presented itself as based on a true story, and its masterful, immersive craft made that claim feel unquestionable. To doubt the haunting after seeing Margaret Kidder's terrified performance or hearing that monstrous get out felt like doubting the reality of fear itself. The movie became the ultimate propaganda for the legend, cementing specific images and sounds in the global consciousness and ensuring that, for a generation, the name Amityville would forever conjure one specific, terrifying vision of a haunted house. But a story this profitable was bound to attract legal challenges, and the courtroom battles that erupted peeled back the layers of the legend in startling ways. The Lutzes themselves initiated a major lawsuit against the producers of the first film, claiming they had been cheated out of their fair share of the movie's massive profits. This legal action, while about money, inadvertently put their entire narrative under a microscope. In the harsh light of a legal deposition, details are scrutinized and memories are tested under oath. The very foundation of their terrifying experience was now a point of contractual dispute, shifting the Amityville Horror from a paranormal mystery into a matter of financial forensic analysis. Yet an even more damning legal entanglement was brewing. William Weber, the defense attorney for Ronald DeFeo Jr., saw his own opportunity in the growing frenzy. He filed a lawsuit against the Lutzes and their publisher, claiming that the story in the book was actually based on confidential information he had shared with George Lutz. Weber alleged that he and Lutz had spent long hours discussing the DeFeo case and that those conversations formed the backbone of the hauntings details. This was more than a simple copyright claim, it was an accusation of stolen ghost stories. But the real bombshell came later, outside the courtroom, when Weber made a stunning admission to reporters and investigators. He stated that the entire haunting narrative was a fabrication concocted during late-night meetings between himself, his client Ronald DeFeo Jr., and George Lutz. He described these sessions vividly, saying the three of them essentially plotted the Amityville Horror over many bottles of wine. Their motives, according to Weber, were a blend of legal strategy and greed. For DeFeo, a new supernatural angle could potentially form the basis for an appeal, arguing that a demonic presence in the house affected his mental state. For Weber and Lutz, the goal was to create a sensational, marketable story that could make them all a great deal of money. This confession is the closest thing the hoax theory has to a smoking gun. Here was a central participant, an officer of the court no less, stating plainly that the legend was a deliberate creation. Skeptics point to this as definitive proof the moment the curtain was pulled back to reveal the machinery of the hoax. Supporters of the haunting, however, were quick to counter. They argued that Weber was a deeply compromised source, a man embittered by being cut out of the lucrative book and movie deals. They suggested his confession was less about truth and more about revenge, an attempt to sabotage the financial success of those who left him behind. This creates a classic, they said impasse. Do we believe the admitted co-conspirator whose profit motive turned to bitterness, or do we believe the family who stood by their story until their deaths? The legal battles ultimately faded without a definitive judicial ruling on the truth of the haunting, but they left behind a landscape littered with doubt. They revealed a story born not in a vacuum of fear, but in a crowded room of competing agendas where spectral phenomena and stock shares seemed to be discussed in the same breath. Years after the frenzy, George Lutz sat down for quieter conversations. In interviews given long after the book tours and movie premieres had ended, his story began to shift in subtle but significant ways. Publicly, he and Kathy always maintained the core truth of their terrifying 28 days. Yet in these later, less guarded moments, George started to draw distinctions. He admitted, sometimes with a hint of weariness, that certain events in the book and film had been, in his words, enhanced for dramatic effect. The line between what literally happened and what made for a better story began to blur even from the source's own mouth. He never fully recanted the haunting, but he reframed it. Instead of focusing on the literal demonic pig or the physical slime, he began to emphasize the overwhelming psychic phenomena they experienced. He spoke more about the oppressive atmosphere, the shared dread, and the psychological unraveling. It was less about specific monsters at the window and more about a pervasive, intelligent energy that manipulated their fears and perceptions. This shift is profoundly telling. It moves the goalposts from a provable haunting with physical evidence to an internal, subjective experience. A demonic infestation can be investigated, but a personal psychic terror exists solely within the minds of those who felt it. This evolution in George's telling mirrors the journey of the Amityville story itself, from a reported paranormal siege to a psychological thriller, and finally to a cultural commodity. When pressed on the contradictions, George often cited the collaborative nature of storytelling. He suggested that writer Jay Anson, working from their taped recollections, had taken creative license to shape a compelling narrative. He also acknowledged that the film adaptation took even greater liberties, compressing events and inventing visuals for the screen. In doing so, George seemed to be separating his family's raw, emotional experience from the polished, commercial product that the world consumed. He was, in a sense, admitting that the Amityville Horror we all know is a hybrid, a fusion of genuine fear and Hollywood horror tropes. This careful dance, never a full confession of a hoax, but a steady admission of enhancement, leaves us with a haunting of a different kind. It suggests a man trapped by his own legend, bound to a story that had grown larger than his actual memory. He could not deny the experience that defined his life, yet he could no longer fully endorse the literal version that had been sold to millions. The terror in the end may have been utterly real to the Lutz family, a perfect storm of suggestion, grief, and panic, but the specific horror, the one with red eyes and a roaring command, that was the commodity, the ghost story crafted not just by a house, but by the very human machinery of books, films, and fame. Yet beyond the stark choice between truth and hoax lies a vast, shadowy landscape of esoteric possibility. For many occult practitioners, the question isn't whether the events were real or fake, but what kind of reality they might represent. One compelling framework moves away from demons and toward the very fabric of emotion itself. This is the theory of psychic residue, often called place memory or stone tape theory. Imagine a location as a kind of spiritual recording device. According to this view, moments of extreme human emotion, especially trauma, terror, or violent death, can imprint themselves onto the environment like a psychic echo etched into the walls. Sensitive individuals, or those under stress, might then unconsciously tune into these recordings, experiencing them as cold spots, fleeting shadows, or even replaying the emotional trauma as their own. In Amityville, the brutal murders of the DeFeo family created a profound shockwave of anguish and fear. This theory suggests the Lutz family, already primed by the house's grim history, may have been picking up on this lingering emotional charge. Their shared dread, the feeling of being watched, the oppressive atmosphere of these could be interpreted not as an active demon, but as the haunting reverberation of a past tragedy, a sorrow so deep it stained the very air. This explanation elegantly sidesteps the need for conscious evil entities. It proposes that the house wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by grief itself, a phenomenon more akin to a persistent, communal nightmare than a personal attack. It turns the haunting inward, focusing on human sensitivity and the lasting power of trauma. Contrasts this sharply with the traditional demonic model championed by the Warrens. This framework is far more intentional and hierarchical. It posits that acts of extreme violence, like the murders, can act as a spiritual beacon or even a subtle tear in reality, a portal. This opening is said to attract negative, non-human entities or amplify pre-existing ones that then infest the location. These entities are not echoes, they are intelligent interlopers with agendas, often described as seeking to attach to inhabitants, feed on fear, and drive them to despair or corruption. The phenomena reported at Amityville, the physical manipulation, the growled commands, the apparent targeting of George's personality, fit neatly into this darker narrative. From this viewpoint, the slime, the marching band music, and the oppressive intelligence weren't residual recordings, but the tactics of a conscious presence engaging in spiritual warfare, using the family's own fears and the location's violent history as weapons against them. So which lens offers a better fit? An occult analyst might see value in both. The psychic residue theory powerfully explains the ambient dread, the time-specific awakenings at 3:15, and the general sense of a replaying tragedy. It feels like a haunting by the past. The demonic model, however, seems tailor-made for the more interactive, personalized, and seemingly intelligent phenomena, the specific threats, the physical manifestations, and the psychological degradation reported. Perhaps the most unsettling synthesis is that both could be true simultaneously. A place heavy with psychic residue from a massacre could become a potent feeding ground for negative entities, a perfect storm where the echo of human suffering attracts something that feeds upon it. This layered interpretation doesn't prove the haunting was real, but it provides a sophisticated vocabulary for what the Lutzes might have genuinely believed they were facing, a nightmare with two faces, one etched in stone from the past, and another, far older and hungrier, looking in from the outside. The media landscape of the late 1970s was a perfect petri dish for a story like Amityville. This was an era captivated by the supernatural, a cultural moment where the occult had moved from fringe belief to mainstream entertainment. Just a few years prior, films like The Exorcist and The Omen had shattered box office records, terrifying audiences with stories of demonic possession and ancient evil that were presented with a chilling, pseudo-documentary realism. These weren't just movies, they were cultural events that fundamentally shifted public perception, making the idea of a demonic infestation in a suburban home feel not just possible, but plausible. The public's appetite for the paranormal was ravenous, and the Amityville Horror arrived as a ready-made, real-world sequel. It wasn't fiction, it was reported as fact, and that distinction made it infinitely more compelling. The media, always sensitive to the public pulse, seized upon it with a fervor that bypassed normal journalistic skepticism. Here was a local news story with all the elements of a blockbuster horror film, and it was playing out in real time with a photogenic, traumatized family at its center. This frenzy found its most powerful amplifier in the daytime talk show circuit. Programs like The Merv Griffin Show, which commanded millions of viewers daily, provided a national stage where the story could be presented not as a controversy, but as a confirmed paranormal drama. George and Kathy Lutz were invited on as guests of honor, sharing their harrowing tale directly to a sympathetic audience. The format was key. Talk shows were designed for entertainment and emotional connection, not for cross-examination. Hosts like Griffin acted as empathetic facilitators, asking leading questions that drew out the most terrifying details without challenging their validity. No skeptical investigators were typically seated beside the Lutzes to question the timeline or the physical evidence. The narrative flowed uninterrupted, its dramatic beats landing with maximum impact on a receptive, at-home audience. This televised testimony was phenomenally effective. Seeing the fear in Kathy Lutz's eyes, hearing the conviction in George's voice, made the story feel incontrovertibly real. The talk show transformed personal testimony into public truth, lending the weight of a major network's platform to a tale that had yet to face any serious, televised scrutiny. The engine of this phenomenon, however, was the era's unique information ecosystem. This was a pre-internet age, a time of information scarcity. There were no fact-checking websites to consult instantly, no online forums to dissect the Warrens' methods or William Weber's legal claims. The public's primary sources were the very entities profiting from the story, the best-selling book, the major motion picture, and the sensationalized coverage in newspapers and magazines competing for eyeballs. Investigative journalism existed, but its skeptical findings were often buried in the back pages, unable to compete with the front cover allure of a demonic pig peering from a window. This created a perfect feedback loop. Sensational media coverage drove public fascination, which in turn sold more books and movie tickets, which justified even more media coverage. Each retelling solidified the legend a little more, smoothing over inconsistencies and burnishing the most dramatic details. The story spread not through careful verification, but through irresistible repetition. In this environment, the burden of proof was inverted. The legend, repeated enough times from enough authoritative-seeming platforms, became the default truth. To doubt it meant doubting a best-selling author, a major film studio, and the tearful testimony of a family on national television. The Amityville Horror became less about what happened in that house and more about what we, as a culture, were primed and eager to believe. It was a haunting constructed not just of shadows and slime, but of newsprint, television signals, and the collective willingness to suspend our disbelief for a truly good scare. Against this backdrop of media frenzy and esoteric theories, a quieter, more methodical investigation was taking place. While talk shows amplified the terror, scientists and professional skeptics were approaching the house not as a supernatural crime scene, but as a puzzle to be solved with logic and evidence. Their findings, often buried under the sensational headlines, systematically dismantled key pillars of the haunting narrative. One of the most famous physical pieces of evidence was the attic door. The Lutzes described a small closet-like room in the attic, accessed by a door that was nearly impossible to keep closed. They claimed it would swing open on its own, suggesting a paranormal force. Investigators, including those from the skeptical group, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, examined the door closely. They discovered a simple, mundane explanation. The door's hinge was badly bent, causing it to not latch properly. Furthermore, the floor of the old house was uneven and sloped. The combination of a faulty hinge and a sloping floor meant the door would naturally swing open due to gravity alone, a common quirk in many older homes. This wasn't a poltergeist, it was basic physics. Then there was the matter of the flies. One of the book's most visceral scenes describes a room suddenly filling with a swarm of large, black flies in the dead of winter, a clear sign of a demonic infestation. Skeptics like investigator Rick Morin went straight to the historical record. He obtained official weather reports for Amityville, New York, for the dates the Lutzes were in the house. The data was unequivocal that December and January were among the coldest on record for the region, with temperatures consistently well below freezing. Entomologists confirmed that the species of fly described could not survive, let alone swarm actively in such conditions. Their life cycle would be impossible. The flies, a central symbol of decay and evil in the story, had a meteorological alibi. They simply could not have been there as described. Perhaps the most devastating blows came from geographical and factual analysis of J. Anson's book itself. Researchers armed with maps and local knowledge took a forensic approach to the text. They found a staggering number of errors. Anson described the house as having a boathouse, which it did not. He wrote of a Catholic church visible from the property when the nearest one was miles away and obscured by trees. He placed a key shopping plaza in the wrong town entirely. These weren't minor oversights, they were fundamental mistakes about the very landscape the story inhabited. If the author couldn't accurately describe what was outside the windows, how much faith could be placed in his descriptions of what happened inside? These errors suggested a writer working from imagination and second-hand notes, not from meticulous, on-the-ground research. He was constructing a setting for a horror story, not documenting a crime scene. Even the iconic Red Room in the basement, described as having walls painted a shocking, saturated crimson, was called into question. Paint analysis later suggested the basement walls were likely a much more ordinary, muddy brown. The most terrifying visual detail of the haunting's epicenter may have been another dramatic embellishment, a splash of literary color applied to heighten fear. These scientific and investigative critiques did not necessarily prove the Lutzes had no frightening experience. What they proved was that the specific, tangible evidence offered to the public crumbled under scrutiny. The door had a bent hinge, the weather was too cold for flies, the book was riddled with factual errors. This left the haunting floating in a realm of pure subjective experience, untethered from the physical world. It transformed the story from a case of paranormal activity into a case study of something else entirely: the human capacity for narrative, the power of belief to reshape memory, and the way a good story, once told, can become more real than the facts it overwrites. Standing before 112 Ocean Avenue, its physical presence is the first clue to its power. The house is a classic Dutch colonial, a style meant to evoke sturdy, wholesome Americana. Yet here, those familiar features twist into something unsettling. The broad, gambrel roof looms like a heavy brow over the facade. Its most famous feature, the pair of quarter-moon windows set high in the attic, stare out like dark, lidless eyes. They give the structure an unnerving semblance of a face, a silent watcher overlooking the property and the river beyond. This was no accident of design, but a deliberate choice by the original architect to add charm. In the context of the story, however, those windows became the eyes of the house itself, a permanent fixture of malevolent observation. Inside, the layout furthers this sense of unease. The rooms are large, but connected in ways that can feel disjointed. The infamous staircase rises steeply from the entry, a climb into the unknown upper floors. The basement, described as the epicenter of the activity, was reportedly damp, low-ceilinged, and accessible only by a narrow, enclosed stairwell, a classic architectural recipe for primal dread. Its location compounds the isolation. Set on a quiet stretch of land at the end of the road, it backs directly onto the murky waters of the Amityville River. On a gray day, the water reflects the gloomy sky, and the house stands utterly alone, a silhouette against an empty expanse. This geographical isolation is critical. It removes the comfort of nearby neighbors, the sense of community watchfulness. Any strange sound in the night could only come from within the house or from the dark, shifting waters outside. This setting inherently primes the mind for vigilance and fear. This brings us to a powerful concept, psychogeography. It's the study of how our physical environment directly shapes our emotions and behaviors. Certain places, through their design, history, and sensory details, can make us feel anxious, peaceful, melancholic, or paranoid. Think of the difference between walking through a bright, open park and a narrow, shadowy alley. Your body reacts before your mind can reason. Now, apply this to 112 Ocean Avenue. You have an isolated, imposing structure with strange, watchful windows. You have a known history of extreme violence within its walls. You have the sensory input of creaking old wood, the smell of the river, the groans of the house settling. This environment is a psychogeographic pressure cooker. It doesn't need a ghost to be frightening. Its very architecture and setting work in concert to suggest threat, to amplify loneliness, and to make every normal sound a potential portent. For a family already aware of the murders, moving into this specific physical space was like stepping onto a psychological stage already set for a horror play. The house, through its sheer presence, became an active participant in the story, a constant, silent suggestion that something was deeply wrong. Whether anything supernatural was there or not, the stage itself was perfectly designed to make the actors believe it was. The story inside the house was terrifying, but what did the outside world see? To find a clearer picture, we must turn to the testimonies of those on the periphery, the friends, police, and neighbors who formed a living ring of witnesses around the Lutz family's ordeal. Their collective accounts create a mosaic, and when assembled, the image is far less consistent than the book or film would have us believe. Friends of the Lutzes who visited during those 28 days reported a range of experiences. Some recalled nothing out of the ordinary, just a pleasant visit in a large, if somewhat dark, home. Others, however, described subtle but undeniable unease. They spoke of feeling watched in certain rooms, of a palpable heaviness in the air that made conversation feel strained. One friend claimed that during a visit, all the toilets in the house turned an inky black color, a phenomenon they could not explain. Another reported seeing a strange, translucent shape move across a wall. These were not the dramatic, cinematic horrors, but smaller, personal encounters with the odd. Crucially, these friends had no apparent financial stake in the story, lending their minor, unsettling experiences a certain credibility. They suggest something was affecting the atmosphere of the home, even if it fell short of a full-scale demonic siege. The official response, however, tells a different story. Police were called to the house on several occasions during the Lutz's stay, usually by concerned neighbors reporting noises or lights. Officers who responded filed straightforward reports. They found a nervous family, but no evidence of criminal activity, no signs of break-ins, and certainly no paranormal phenomena. In one notable instance, after the family had fled, officers accompanied George Lutz back to the house to retrieve belongings. They walked through the silent, empty rooms with him. While George was visibly anxious, the officers observed nothing unusual, no slime, no cold spots, no disembodied voices. Their professional assessment was clear: the house was just a house. This stark disconnect is pivotal. Law enforcement represents an objective, trained perspective, one conditioned to look for tangible evidence of a threat. Their repeated finding of nothing amiss stands in direct contradiction to the family's escalating claims of a physical, violent haunting. It forces a difficult question: if the phenomena were so intense and physical, why were they completely invisible to neutral observers walking the same halls? Perhaps the most damaging contradictions came from the people who lived closest, the neighbors. In interviews conducted both during the media frenzy and years later, their stories often conflicted sharply with the Lutz timeline and the reported severity of events. Several neighbors stated they never witnessed the bizarre exterior manifestations described in the book, like the glowing red windows or the spectral pig at the pane. More tellingly, some neighbors challenged the very narrative of a sudden, terrified midnight flight. They recalled seeing the Lutzes moving out in a more orderly fashion over several days, loading a U-Haul truck in broad daylight. This directly undermines the iconic climax of the story, the image of a family fleeing in sheer panic with only the clothes on their backs. Other neighbors noted that the Lutz children were seen playing outside happily during the period they were supposedly trapped inside by terror. These are not minor discrepancies. They strike at the heart of the story's dramatic truth. The neighbors, with their daily, mundane view of the property, provide a ground-level reality check that the insulated, high-drama account of the Lutzes often fails. So what do we make of this contradictory chorus? The friend who saw a shadow, the officer who saw nothing, the neighbor who saw a U-Haul truck instead of a frantic escape. This mosaic doesn't give us a single, easy answer. Instead, it paints a portrait of a situation where perception was everything. The friends, already aware of the house's history and sensitive to the family's growing anxiety, may have been primed to interpret normal shadows or house noises as something more. Their minor phenomena could be the result of suggestion, a shared psychological echo within the Lutz's social circle. The police, with no such priming, saw only physical facts. The neighbors, observing from a distance without the intense emotional pressure, saw the mundane logistics of a family moving out of a house they could not afford. This collection of external perspectives is the ultimate triangulation tool. It suggests the true haunting may have been a profoundly internal experience, one that radiated out to affect sensitive visitors, but remained invisible to those outside its emotional field. The terror was real to those who felt it, but its footprint on the objective world was frustratingly faint, easily overwritten by the simpler, quieter testimonies of daily life just beyond the property line. The Warrens' demonic diagnosis demanded a specific solution, a spiritual counterattack only the Catholic Church could authorize. They insisted that during the haunting, the Lutzes had called upon a young priest, Father Ralph Pecoraro, to bless the house. According to their account, the moment Father Pecoraro began sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers, a hostile force responded with shocking violence. He was reportedly shoved by an unseen hand, and a sense of overwhelming malice filled the room. Fleeing the house, he allegedly developed a sudden, high fever and found his hand mysteriously wounded, as if burned or blistered. This story became a cornerstone of the Warrens' case, framing the haunting not as a passive psychic echo, but as an entity with a conscious, violent aversion to sacred intervention. It transformed the house from a spooky location into a battleground in a cosmic war, yet when we seek official validation from the Church itself, we find a profound and telling silence. Father Pecoraro, who later became a Monsignor, consistently downplayed the event in public statements. He acknowledged visiting the house at the family's request, but described his experience in far less dramatic terms, attributing any illness afterward to coincidence. The Archdiocese never issued any statement confirming a supernatural attack on one of its priests. This reticence is not an accident, it is policy. The Catholic Church maintains an intensely skeptical, rigorous process for investigating claims of demonic activity. Parish priests cannot simply perform an exorcism on request. The rite is treated with extreme gravity, reserved only for cases where all natural and psychological explanations have been exhausted. A team including psychiatrists and theologians must rule out mental illness, fraud, or environmental factors before granting permission for the ancient ritual. This institutional caution creates a fascinating tension. On one side, you have popular esoteric belief, fueled by figures like the Warrens, where demonic signs are interpreted broadly and dramatically. On the other, you have a 2,000-year-old institution that moves with glacial caution, aware that what looks like possession can often be psychosis, and what feels like a haunted house can be a home under severe emotional strain. So why was there never a formal exorcism of 112 Ocean Avenue? The Church likely never saw sufficient evidence to warrant one. The fever and wounded hand, if they occurred at all, could have natural explanations. The family's testimony, while compelling, was just that, testimony, and it was already becoming entangled with book deals and media appearances. To the Vatican, the Amityville case probably looked less like a clear case of demonic infestation and more like a messy human drama with strong financial incentives, happening in a culture currently obsessed with cinematic demonology. The Church's refusal to engage officially speaks volumes. It suggests that within the very tradition the Warrens invoked, the story failed to meet the high bar of supernatural proof. This leaves us with two conflicting models of religious esoteric practice: the popular, emotive version that validates personal terror, and the institutional, judicial version that demands evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. In Amityville, the former built a legend, while the latter, through its silence, cast the longest shadow of doubt. The story refused to stay confined to one house or one family. It metastasized into a sprawling franchise, a cinematic universe of terror long before the concept had a name. Following the smash success of the first film, producers realized they had not just a movie, but a brand. The result was a flood of sequels and spin-offs, over 20 films and counting, each drifting further from the shore of the original claims. The Amityville Horror Part 2 in 1982 shifted focus to the sole surviving DeFeo daughter, a character who never existed, weaving a tale of reincarnation and psychic connection. From there, the series leaped into pure, unconstrained invention. We got Amityville 3D, a generic haunted house story with added visual gimmickry. The franchise discovered that the name alone was a powerful lure, and the plots became unmoored from any pretense of truth, sending the infamous building into space in Amityville in space, or pitting it against other horror icons. The house itself became a reusable prop, a logo of horror slapped onto increasingly outlandish narratives about dolls, curses, and time loops. This dilution was the ultimate irony. The real haunting was no longer in the phenomena, but in the relentless, commercial echo of the story itself. Yet this very proliferation cemented its cultural power. Amityville evolved from a specific address into a universal shorthand, a brand name for a very particular kind of fear. It became the archetype of the suburban haunted house. Before Amityville, cinematic horror often resided in Gothic castles, remote hotels, or cursed rural villages. This story planted terror squarely in the middle-class dream, in a spacious home on a quiet street where families sought a fresh start. That betrayal of the domestic sanctuary is its core genius. It exploited the universal anxiety that the one place meant to be your refuge could turn against you. The haunted house trope was forever changed. Countless films and television shows that followed, from Poltergeist to The Conjuring, owe a direct debt to that Dutch colonial blueprint, the idea that evil could be lurking not in a distant forest, but in your own child's closet, behind the cheerful facade of your own home. So why did this story, among so many others, achieve this iconic status? Its themes tapped into a deep well of collective anxieties. On one level, it is the ultimate home invasion narrative, but the invaders are not human. The sanctity of the family unit is violated from within its own walls by an unseen force that pits father against mother and preys on the children. This plays on our primal fear of unsafe shelter. More profoundly, it grapples with the concept of inherited sin or spiritual debt. The Lutzes were not the original perpetrators, yet they seem to inherit the consequences of the DeFeo murders, suggesting that evil could stain a location like a toxin, affecting anyone who dared to reside there. This idea of a place being cursed, of past violence poisoning the present, resonates with a timeless, almost superstitious dread. It asks a terrifying question: can we ever truly escape the history of the ground we walk on, or are we forever accountable for the sins that soaked into its foundation? That question, wrapped in the mundane package of a family moving into a new home, is what granted the Amityville Horror its strange and enduring power, transforming a disputed local legend into a permanent fixture in our modern mythology of fear. The house has not stood empty, a shrine to its own legend. Over the decades since the Lutzes fled, several other families have called 112 Ocean Avenue home, and their experiences form the most direct challenge to the hauntings narrative. The most significant of these are the current owners who have resided in the house since the 1990s. For them, the infamous property is simply home. They have raised their children within its walls, celebrated holidays in its rooms, and gone about the mundane business of daily life. In numerous interviews, they have been unequivocal. They have experienced no paranormal activity, no slime, no demonic voices, no spectral pigs at the window. Their most profound haunting, they often state with a note of frustration, has been the relentless stream of curiosity seekers, trespassers, and tourists who peer over their fence, hoping to catch a glimpse of the horror. They openly criticize the Lutz story, viewing it as a fabricated tale that has brought them decades of unwanted attention and violated their privacy. Their testimony is powerful precisely because of its normalcy. It suggests that whatever happened during those 28 days was an anomaly, a perfect storm that either departed with the Lutzes or never existed in the form we were told. This modern era of normalcy has also been scrutinized by a new generation of ghost hunters, armed with technology the Warrens could scarcely have imagined. In the years since the story broke, numerous paranormal investigation teams have sought permission to examine the house, hoping to capture definitive proof with advanced gear. They arrive with electromagnetic field, or EMF, meters designed to detect fluctuations believed by some to indicate spiritual presence. They use digital audio recorders for EVP sessions, far more sensitive than the reel-to-reel tapes of the 70s. They point thermal imaging cameras at the walls and floors, looking for unexplained cold spots with scientific precision. The results of these investigations have been, by and large, inconclusive. While teams occasionally report minor anomalies, a fleeting spike on a meter or a faint, ambiguous sound on a recording, nothing has ever approached the scale or clarity of the phenomena described in the original account. No thermal camera has captured a clear, human-shaped cold spot. No digital audio file contains an unambiguous, intelligent command to get out. The evidence remains in the realm of the maybe, the possible, and the highly subjective. This creates a striking paradox. The original haunting was reported in an era with primitive technology, relying solely on human testimony and a few blurry photographs. Yet the story it produced was one of intense, physical, and interactive horror. Today, with sensitive instruments capable of monitoring the environment in ways the human senses cannot, the house appears quiet. The most dramatic evidence comes from a time when it could not be rigorously verified, while the era of verification has yielded only silence or ambiguous whispers. This contrast forces a difficult question. Did the entity, if it ever existed, depart for good after its dramatic performance? Or does the very act of searching for it with gadgets miss the point of what the Lutzes experienced, a phenomenon that was less about electromagnetic fields and more about a direct, psychological assault? Perhaps the most telling finding of the modern investigations is the simplest. The house, when observed under technological scrutiny, behaves like a house. Its creaks are from old timber, its drafts are from imperfect seals, its magnetic fields are from wiring and appliances. The terror, it seems, was not in the machinery of the building, but in the minds of those who lived within it during one specific, pressure-filled month under the weight of a terrifying history and their own mounting desperation. The silence of the present becomes the loudest argument against the haunting of the past, suggesting that some stories are so powerful they only need to be told once to live forever. Perhaps the most human explanation lies not in the supernatural, but in the profound and sometimes terrifying power of the mind itself. Psychological analysis offers a compelling lens through which to view the Lutz family's ordeal, one that doesn't require demons, only a deep understanding of how stress and belief can warp reality. Under extreme duress, the human psyche is capable of constructing its own prison, brick by terrifying brick. Consider the immense pressures the family faced, a crushing mortgage on a house they could barely afford, the daily weight of knowing a massacre occurred in their bedrooms, and the social stigma that surely followed them in their small community. This created a state of chronic, high-alert anxiety, a perfect breeding ground for what psychologists might call a shared psychotic disorder, or folie à familiale. This is a phenomenon where delusional beliefs and perceptions are transmitted and reinforced within a close-knit group, often a family, creating a private, self-confirming reality. It begins with a seed of fear, in this case, the house's grim history. That seed is watered by suggestion, perhaps from George's initial unease or a child's nightmare. In the echo chamber of their shared stress, a strange noise is no longer the house settling, it becomes a footstep. A cold draft is no longer a leaky window, it becomes a spectral breath. Each member's fearful interpretation validates the others, creating a feedback loop that escalates from unease to outright terror. Their shared belief made the haunting real to them, generating physical symptoms like the 3:15 a.m. awakenings, which could easily be a stress-induced sleep disorder and even manifesting as shared hallucinations. This is not a sign of weakness, but a testament to how our brains, under siege, seek patterns and explanations, even terrifying ones, to make sense of overwhelming anxiety. History provides eerie parallels in cases of mass psychogenic illness, where groups of people, often in high-stress environments like schools or factories, begin experiencing similar physical symptoms, from dizziness and nausea to convulsions, with no identifiable physical cause. The symptoms are utterly real to those suffering, but their origin is psychological, spreading through sight, sound, and the power of suggestion. In Amityville, the symptoms were not rashes or fainting spells, but cold spots, phantom odors, and the sense of a looming presence, all classic somatic expressions of intense dread. The family's financial desperation adds another critical layer. The need to escape an impossible financial burden can create a powerful, if unconscious, motivation. A haunting provides a socially acceptable, even sympathetic, reason to abandon a crippling debt. It transforms a failure into a survival story, a victimhood that carries its own strange currency. This psychological framework does not accuse the Lutzes of conscious fraud. Instead, it proposes a more tragic and nuanced possibility that they were the authors and the victims of their own nightmare, trapped in a collective story so convincing that their own bodies and perceptions conspired to make it true. Their terror was absolutely genuine, but its source may have been internal, a perfect storm of belief, stress, and circumstance that made the walls themselves seem to whisper. We are left with two compelling, yet contradictory, narratives. One is a story of supernatural siege, the other a case of profound psychological stress. But there is a third possibility, one that requires neither demons nor delusions, only human cunning. This is the hoax hypothesis, a coldly logical argument that the Amityville Horror was a deliberate fabrication, a modern legend stitched together from opportunity, greed, and the perfect tragic backdrop. To evaluate it, we must piece together motive and means, asking not only who benefited, but how such an elaborate story could have been sustained. The motives, when laid out, form a powerful trifecta. First, the Lutzes themselves were in dire financial straits, having overextended themselves on a mortgage they could not realistically maintain. Abandoning the house meant financial ruin unless they had a spectacular, sympathy-inducing reason to do so. Second, their lawyer, William Weber, had a client in Ronald DeFeo Jr. whose insanity defense had failed. A new narrative of a demonically infested house could provide fresh grounds for an appeal, a new context for DeFeo's claimed voices. Third, and most broadly, there was the immense, untapped market for a true-life horror story in a culture ravenous for it. The means to capitalize on this motive presented itself almost immediately. Weber's own confession, though from a compromised source, provides the blueprint. He described late-night meetings with George Lutz and Ronald DeFeo, where they, in his words, plotted the Amityville Horror over wine. Their goal was to create a sensational story they could all profit from. This timeline is crucial. The family fled in January 1976. By February, they had secured a book deal with Jay Anson. The speed of this transition from traumatized victims to contracted authors is startling. The book was published in 1977 and became an instant bestseller. Movie rights were sold for a reported $250,000, a fortune at the time. The financial rescue was not just timely, it was transformative. From the brink of bankruptcy, the Lutzes were suddenly affluent. This sequence doesn't disprove their experience, but it creates an undeniable pattern where terror and treasure are inextricably linked. Logistical questions about the haunting itself further strain credibility. The family reported phenomena of shocking physical violence, doors being ripped from hinges, pounding that shook the entire house, and slime oozing from the walls. Yet when police officers and subsequent owners inspected the property, they found no lasting structural damage, no persistent stains, no evidence of such violent manifestations. How could forces powerful enough to terrorize a family into fleeing leave no verifiable trace on the building materials? Then there is the staging. Could a family have produced these effects themselves? Many of the reported phenomena are frustratingly simple to replicate. A cold draft can be created by opening a window. Strange odors can be introduced. Waking at the same time each night can be set by an alarm clock. The infamous cloven hoof prints in the snow could have been made with a simple tool. The bent silverware required only human strength. Even the psychological atmosphere could be manufactured through sleep deprivation and the constant reinforcement of fear within the family unit. The absence of independent, corroborating witnesses to the most extreme events is telling. The neighbors saw no glowing windows, no spectral figures. The priests who visited did not confirm the violent attacks described in the book. The haunting, in its most dramatic form, existed only within the closed system of the Lutz household and the pages Jay Anson later wrote. When woven together, these threads form a coherent, if cynical, narrative of opportunity. A tragic murder provided the perfect, grim foundation. A financially desperate family and an ambitious lawyer saw a chance to build something lucrative upon it. A writer with a flair for drama shaped their anecdotes into a gripping, novelistic account. Paranormal investigators, seeking a career-defining case, validated the supernatural angle. A voracious media ecosystem, hungry for a real-life horror story, amplified it without scrutiny, and a public, primed by films like The Exorcist, was eager to believe. In this view, the Amityville Horror is not a ghost story, but a story about the haunting power of a story itself, a legend crafted from whole cloth that became so vividly told, it took on a life of its own. The real horror may not be what happened in that house, but how easily a perfect storm of human need can conjure a nightmare that the world willingly accepts as truth. Ultimately, the evidence for a hoax is overwhelming, a mountain of contradictions and confessions, yet the legend stands unshaken. This stubborn endurance points to something deeper than facts, a philosophical puzzle about why we cling to certain stories. The Amityville Horror persists not because it is true, but because it feels true on a primal level. It speaks to a fundamental human itch, our innate fascination with the unseen, the unexplained, the crack in reality's door. We are a species wired for pattern recognition, always searching for meaning in the shadows, and stories of the supernatural offer a tantalizing answer, a confirmation that there is more to the world than what we can measure. This particular tale, however, zeroes in on our most intimate anxieties. Its true power is symbolic, a perfect storm of universal fears. First, it violates the sanctity of the home, that one place we are taught is our ultimate refuge. The idea that your own walls could turn against you, that safety is an illusion, is a terror that resonates in every culture. Second, it exposes the secrets festering beneath a community's quiet surface. Amityville was a picturesque suburb, the epitome of the American dream, yet it concealed a brutal massacre and later a potential fraud. This taps into our deep-seated suspicion that behind every neat lawn and friendly smile, there might be a hidden history of violence or deceit. Finally, and most powerfully, it attacks the family unit itself. The haunting doesn't just scare the Lutzes, it systematically tears them apart, corrupting George's personality, terrifying the children, and isolating them from the world. It presents the family not as a fortress, but as a fragile vessel, easily capsized by forces from outside or within. These themes are archetypal. They are the bedrock of countless myths and fairy tales, retold for centuries because they address the core vulnerabilities of the human condition. So, in a profound sense, the Amityville Horror is a true story. Its truth may not reside in the factual accuracy of green slime or a demonic pig, but in its emotional and mythological resonance. It is true to our fear of the dark in our own homes, true to our suspicion of the past, and true to our anxiety about protecting those we love from invisible threats. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue becomes less a specific location and more a stage, a modern setting for an ancient play about insecurity and the unknown. We keep returning to it because, hoax or not, it holds up a dark mirror, and in its reflection we see the outlines of our own deepest, most private fears. The Amityville story feels unique, but it is part of a long tradition of haunted houses that captured the public imagination. To truly understand its place, we must briefly step into the shadows of other infamous residences. Take the Borley Rectory in England, often called the most haunted house in the country. For decades, from the 1920s onward, residents and visitors reported a catalog of classic phenomena: phantom footsteps, ghostly nuns seen in the garden, unexplained ringing bells, and messages pleading for help spelled out on mirrors. Like Amityville, it attracted high-profile paranormal investigators, most notably Harry Price, whose book and media savvy turned the rectory into a national sensation. The parallels are striking: a sprawling, isolated house, a compelling narrative built on witness testimony, and a single, charismatic investigator whose findings dominated the public story. Yet a crucial difference emerged later. Skeptics meticulously dissected Price's methods, suggesting he may have staged some phenomena himself. Borley, much like Amityville, remains a classic haunted house story where the evidence rests primarily on personal accounts that later came under intense suspicion of fabrication. A more robust comparison lies across the Atlantic with the Enfield poltergeist. This case, unfolding in a London council house between 1977 and 1979, centered on two young sisters, Janet and Margaret Hodgson. The reported activity was astonishingly physical and interactive, furniture sliding across rooms, loud knocking from within walls, and the 11-year-old Janet speaking in a deep, raspy voice, claiming to be a former resident who had died in the house. The similarities to Amityville are immediately apparent. A family, particularly children at the epicenter, claims of a violent, communicative entity, and a media circus that descended upon the home. Investigators from the Society for Psychical Research documented the case extensively, capturing audio recordings of the gruff voice and photographs of levitating objects. Here, however, the paths diverge significantly. Enfield had something Amityville largely lacked: multiple independent witnesses. Police officers, journalists, and trained researchers all claimed to have seen and heard the phenomena firsthand. While skeptics later argued the girls could have been cleverly faking some events, the volume of credible, outside observation makes Enfield a far more challenging case to dismiss outright as a simple hoax. The evidence, though controversial, is more substantial and multi-sourced. Placing Amityville side by side with these cases reveals a telling spectrum. On one end, you have Borley, a story built largely on the work of one investigator and accounts that later faced serious allegations of embellishment. On the other, Enfield, with its wealth of witness testimony and recorded anomalies that continue to fuel debate. Amityville sits somewhere in the murky middle. It shares Borley's reliance on a central investigative narrative, courtesy of the Warrens, and its subsequent exposure to damning financial motives and factual errors. Yet it lacks Enfield's core of outside witnesses who observed the most extreme events. Police who visited the Lutz home consistently reported nothing out of the ordinary. This comparative lens helps us assess Amityville not as an isolated freak event, but as a particular type of paranormal narrative. It is a story where the haunting was almost entirely contained within the family unit, amplified by sympathetic investigators, and then magnified to global proportions by a perfectly timed media machine. Its uniqueness lies not in the phenomena described, which echo countless other ghost stories, but in the breathtaking speed and scale with which it was commercialized. While other cases simmered in local papers or psychic journals, Amityville exploded into a fully formed cultural product, a book and a movie, almost before the dust had settled in the empty house. This comparison ultimately asks us a clarifying question: are we fascinated by the haunting itself, or by the masterful way this particular story was told and sold? Beyond the debate over truth and lies lies a quieter, more troubling question of spiritual ethics. When we traffic in stories of the supernatural, what responsibilities do we carry, and what unseen harm might we leave in our wake? The Amityville case, viewed through an esoteric lens, is not just a mystery, it is a profound lesson in consequences. For the families who lived in the house after the Lutzes, the true haunting was the relentless shadow of the legend itself. Their peaceful home was transformed into a macabre tourist attraction, their privacy shattered by gawkers and ghost hunters peering over the fence. They endured the constant, low-grade distress of being seen not as neighbors, but as caretakers of a horror museum. This is a tangible, human cost, a form of spiritual trespass where a fabricated or exaggerated narrative imposes a lasting stigma on a place and the innocent people who dwell there. Their experience raises a critical ethical point in the occult community where the power of belief is taken seriously. What right do we have to label a location as cursed or infested without ironclad evidence, knowing that label can become a self-fulfilling prophecy of fear and disruption for others? This ethical breach extends backward in time to the exploitation of a profound human tragedy. The DeFeo murders were not a plot device, they were a shattering real-life event that ended 6 lives and devastated a community. The Amityville legend appropriated this raw grief, using it as a compelling backdrop to sell books and movie tickets. From an esoteric standpoint, This is a form of spiritual vampirism, feeding creative and commercial energy off the unresolved anguish and violent death of real people. It trivializes their memory, reducing their horrific end to a convenient origin story for a demonic pig. For those who believe in the subtle realms where emotional energy persists, this kind of exploitation can be seen as a further violation, stirring and distorting the psychic residue of that tragedy for entertainment value rather than respectful understanding or closure. The ethical practitioner would approach such a site with solemnity and a desire to bring peace, not to amplify the terror for profit. Furthermore, cases like Amityville do a deep disservice to the entire field of legitimate paranormal research. For every diligent investigator using careful methodology, trying to understand genuine anomalies, there is the specter of this sensationalized story. It provides easy ammunition for skeptics to dismiss all inquiry as gullible or fraudulent. It muddies the waters, making it harder for serious people to be taken seriously. When commerce and sensationalism become the driving forces, the pursuit of understanding is corrupted. The focus shifts from asking what is really happening to asking what will sell the most books or attract the most viewers. This commercialization creates a perverse incentive where the more outrageous the claim, the greater the reward, eroding any standard of evidence or ethical restraint. So where does the responsibility lie within the esoteric community itself? Those who present themselves as authorities on the unseen world carry a weighty burden. When they publicly validate an unverified claim like Amityville, lending their perceived expertise to its credibility, they are not just offering an opinion, they are shaping belief. This influence demands rigorous integrity. It calls for a commitment to distinguishing between personal intuition and demonstrable fact, between a client's compelling story and corroborating evidence. The ethical practitioner must act as a filter, not a megaphone, applying healthy skepticism even within a framework of belief. The Amityville saga stands as the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when that line is obliterated, when spiritual diagnosis, media hunger, and financial opportunity fuse into an unstoppable machine. It reminds us that in the realms of shadow and spirit, our words have power, and with that power must come a profound duty to truth, to compassion for the living and the dead, and to the preservation of a search for the genuine mystery, untainted by the hunger for a good, marketable scare. The house did not remain a frozen monument to fear. Life, in its stubbornly ordinary way, moved back in. After the Lutzes fled, the property sat vacant for only a short time before new owners arrived, people who saw not a haunted mansion, but a large, waterfront property in need of a family. The most significant of these were James and Barbara Cromarty, who purchased the house in the late 1970s and lived there for over a decade. They were followed by others, each family layering their own daily memories over the infamous legend. For them, the most disruptive force was never supernatural, it was the constant stream of curiosity seekers. Cars would slow to a crawl on Ocean Avenue, their occupants pointing cameras. Strangers would sometimes wander right up to the front door, peering into windows. The house's very identity had become a public spectacle, its address a beacon for the morbidly fascinated. To reclaim their privacy and sanity, the Cromartys made a simple, practical decision. They changed the house's address from 112 Ocean Avenue to 108 Ocean Avenue. More strikingly, they altered the most famous architectural feature of all, replacing the haunting quarter-moon windows with simple, rectangular panes. This was not an act of spiritual cleansing, but a pragmatic effort to make the house less recognizable, to strip it of its iconic, storybook silhouette, and allow it to fade back into the normalcy of the neighborhood. The public statements from these subsequent residents form a chorus of grounded denial. Barbara Cromarty was particularly vocal, giving interviews where she expressed not fear, but profound frustration. She described raising her children in the house with absolutely no unusual incidents. Her most chilling experiences, she said, involved finding strangers on her property in the middle of the night. Another later owner, David O'Brien, echoed this sentiment after purchasing the home in the 1990s. He stated plainly that in all his years living there, he never witnessed a single paranormal event. For him, the only negative energy came from the lingering stigma and the occasional trespasser hoping to glimpse a ghost. These aren't the words of people hiding a dark secret. They are the exasperated declarations of homeowners tired of a narrative that has hijacked their private lives. Their testimony is powerful precisely because of its mundane conviction. They have no book to sell, no movie deal to promote. Their interest lies in peace and quiet, in being left alone to live in the house they call home. This grounded perspective is the legend's most potent counterpoint. While the world sees a gateway to hell, the people who actually sleep within its walls see creaky floorboards and a beautiful water view. They worry about mortgages, not demons, about leaking roofs rather than oozing slime. Their lived reality transforms the Amityville Horror from an objective truth into a subjective story, one that belonged to a specific family under a specific set of pressures for 28 specific days. For everyone else, it was just a house. This dichotomy forces a humbling question. If the haunting was a permanent, intrinsic feature of the location, why did it vanish so completely for those who came after? Why would a demonic force, having staged such a dramatic and successful eviction, simply retire? The silence of the decades that followed speaks louder than any ghostly groan. It suggests that whatever happened in 1975 was not about the bricks and mortar, but about the fragile human chemistry that briefly occupied them. The house itself is neutral, a silent witness that has borne the weight of 1,000 projected nightmares, while the families inside simply lived their lives, proving that sometimes the most powerful act of all is to live quietly in a place others fear. So we are left standing at a great divide. On one side, the raw, terrifying testimony of a family who lived through 28 days of escalating dread, a story so vivid and emotionally consistent it has chilled millions. On the other, a mountain of contradictions, a lawyer's stunning confession of a plot hatched over wine, a timeline where financial rescue followed terror with suspicious speed, and a house that has remained stubbornly, mundanely quiet for every family since. The evidence for a deliberate hoax is compelling, logical, and rooted in the all-too-human motives of greed and desperation. Yet, the Lutzes never fully recanted, and the visceral power of their account lingers, a ghost that refuses to be dismissed by mere facts. The frustrating, beautiful truth is that definitive proof may forever elude us. The case is cold, the key players are gone, and we are left in the realm of belief. You must weigh the chilling personal conviction against the cold calculus of opportunity and decide where the balance lies for you. This leads to one final, perhaps more important question. Does it actually matter if the Amityville Horror was real? Its reality, in a cultural sense, is undeniable. It reshaped our idea of the haunted house, influenced laws regarding seller disclosure of property histories, and launched an entire industry of paranormal investigation into the mainstream. It became a modern folktale, a story we tell in the dark about the dark places in our own homes and minds. That impact, that lingering shiver when you hear a floorboard creak at 3:15 in the morning, is utterly real regardless of what happened in 1975. The legend of Amityville endures not because we have proven it, but because we have needed it, a perfect vessel for our ancient fears. So we leave the mystery with you. Read the books, study the skeptical reports, listen to the tapes, and walk the quiet street in your own mind. Then ask yourself, what do you believe happened in that house? Share your verdict in the comments below, for in the end, the true haunting of Amityville may not be in its past, but in its endless